Hi, welcome to Quirky Queen's Journals. My name's Kirsten. So today we're using the gel plate and we're doing some more abstract art. But what we're doing today is concentrating mostly on textures. And I do not use a brayer until I put on the final paint layer to pull it off. So we're mainly using paintbrushes, our fingers and water and paper to do a lot of texture on the gel plate. So this is a full process video. Obviously I've left out the drying time and there's parts where the paintbrush will leave the screen because I'm going to add water or paint or dryness or whatever to it. But apart from that, it's a full process video. So here I've made a bit of an error in my shape. I just felt I was keeping the shape quite rounded and then I added in a kind of sharp corner. And the reason I did that was because it felt a bit squashed at the top of the gel plate. And what I should have done is let it kind of gradually just disappear. So anyway, I've rectified it, I remove it. So this is a big size 24 watercolour paintbrush I'm using with Paynes Grey. Now, a lot of the paints I'm using are either Amsterdam, Sennelier, Liquitex Basics or cheap Art Deco premium paints from a cheap shop in the UK called The Range. So like I said, I'm just trying to make these kind of quite rounded, curved shapes, but trying to also make them separate in their own way. The paint's quite thick on them just now, but part of putting in the texture actually helps remove a lot of that excess paint, which helps it dry faster. So I've just added some water to the paintbrush and it has made a difference to the shapes that were being made. What I want with the texture is I don't want it to look forced. And so sometimes what happens is when you move your paintbrush in a certain way and you think, oh, I like that, then you try and force it. And I find the water's quite helpful at changing the texture of the paint to the extent that you have to kind of change the way you're moving the paintbrush. I also like the way the water breaks it up. It's unpredictable. So you can't overly plan how it's going to look. But I do know that this C-shaped curve, the one I'm working on just now, is the bolder, darker shape. And then the one crossing over it in the kind of upside down horseshoe, the watery one, is more of like a cloudy texture. So variety is a lot of what makes abstract art interesting. And for me, that's one way so the colour's the same, the shapes are pretty similar, but the edges are different, the pattern on it's different. There is differences, so they give different messages. But they still work well together because they do have some similarities. So this is a skewer that's blunt. I've been using this to mix paint for about 2 years, so that skewer's well rounded. And I'm just using the side of it to try and scrape some of the paint away, but in a way that leaves because that skewer has had paint added to it over 2 years, it's got a lot of ridges that are not exact. So using the side of that paintbrush has allowed me to apply, the side of that skewer has allowed me to apply lines that are not uniform. Now here I just scrunched up a piece of paper, and because there was a lot of wetness in there, the paper almost kind of sucks up some of that wetness and blends in with the paint, and it's just helped. To me, it looks like it's making it almost like a gas, and then the big C is more solid. That's me cleaning the bit where I made a mistake. I've just got some water and then the towel. But do you see there, the textures are quite different in the two shapes, even though Their sizes are similar. Obviously the colour's similar. So anyway, that was my first layer and I'm very pleased with it. And I've got more to add. This is a scoring tool. It has little balls on the end, so I'm doing a little bit of sgraffito here by putting in some dots. And what I'm going to do is, one end of the C shape has, these dots are much more sharp, they're more obvious, they're spaced close together, and then as I gradually work my way around the C, the dots will become more sparse. They'll have bits of paint left inside them. And I just did that to add some variety. And hopefully it also kind of helps give a bit of movement, because the left-hand side of that big C shape is quite straight. And then it's a lot more curved than the right. So hopefully adding a bit of variety to the pattern that's in that will help create some movement as well. This is all experimental. I just keep doing things like this because it really helps me learn and it lets me see what I think works well together. And it is nice to see a change. You know, if you think about that big C shape as, you know, as going through time, it does change. So you can see there that the dots are much lighter and further apart. So this has been drying and it's probably dried for about 15 minutes. Because I'd done a lot of work on it, it was already quite dry. So this is cadmium lemon yellow and it's one of my favourite colours. Because if you apply it as an underpainting, it makes colours on top of it quite bright. However, that's not its purpose here. I just think the Paynes grey and the cadmium lemon yellow go very well together and they're a kind of good substitute for black and white. Now this is a sponge on a stick and what I'm doing is I'm just patting that paint down so that gradually from where it starts on the right hand side to where it ends on the left hand side, it's quite a gradual disappearing of it. Also, the sponge gives it, it's actually quite, the sponge makes it quite flat, but also it's almost like a fine sandpaper look to it, if that makes sense. It gives it like a fine speckle. So what I did notice though, that sponge is quite square. So I had to be quite careful to stay on the point because I was creating quite square rectangle shapes with it, as well as the kind of speckled even look. So it does, this is all, I have put this on normal speed and, you know, everything that's happening here is happening in, you know, real time and, how do I put it? A lot of the movements you make are quite slow. They're quite, in some ways they're quite, while they're not planned, they're still quite methodical in some ways because to make it graduate away, you know, that takes a bit of work to blend it from thicker to thinner. Now here we have a lot of water on this paintbrush and I'm trying to do the graduation effect again with it. And water actually makes it a lot easier because you can just have your paintbrush drier at the darker end and at the end where it disappears you can have it a lot wetter. But also we're using the exact same paint but we're getting a much different effect from it because this time we're using the water to make the texture and not a dry sponge. We're using a watery paintbrush. I do think a lot of the effects that we're using here could apply to, like, you know, abstract landscapes, because so the water, obviously you get water, but things like using the scoring tool to, you know, point away marks as like maybe the wind hitting against, you know, the rock face. Obviously the sponge gave it like a kind of sand look. So there is something quite kind of rugged about it so far, I think. So I was using a straw to make those circles, but they were very uniform, very boring. And so that's the scrunched up bit of paper again, just to try and disperse them a bit, I suppose. And then I remembered, oh, I've got a toothbrush sitting there in my art tools pile. And so I'm using the toothbrush to give it a kind of wiped away look. And again, everything I'm doing is I'm trying to add some graduation to it, as if it's just disappearing as it gets closer to the edges. So far we've used a sponge, a toothbrush, water, paintbrush, paper, I suppose like the rounded edge kind of skewer and scoring tool. So really we're not using anything that I suppose you would purchase a paintbrush. But my point is these are things that are just lying about that I'm using. So I'm trying to add the yellow in a variety of places, but just in small parts. As if the Paynes grey is like a cove, and then, you know, the cadmium lemon yellow is like water and sand, the grassy verge, things like that. Without it being a landscape, it is totally abstract. There is no figurative in here at all. What I'm also finding is that I'm applying paint, but I'm also taking a lot of paint back off to create the textures and the different looks. And as you add more layers as well, you need to be a bit gentler going over the other paint layers, because you don't want to rub them away. And I do start using the paper to take paint off a lot more, and I do need to be quite gentle with it so that I'm not removing the previous layers, because I've put a lot of hard work into them. I wasn't so keen in this shape, but in the end it actually did work. So that was another drying time. Now that yellow, the cadmium lemon yellow, it was at least half an hour to dry because of the watery area. Now this is turquoise blue, and this is the Art Deco premium range, which is the cheap paint. And I'm just applying it in a paintbrush that I'm holding very loosely at the top. It's not going very well. This spiral isn't, it doesn't really fit in with the overall kind of aesthetic of the whole picture. But this is where I start to remove the paint quite a lot, and then what happens is I actually stamp the paint. I've took off this elsewhere, and it just gives such a little hint of it, and it really works. You'll see it in a minute if I ever stop painting. So do you see I was pressing quite lightly there? And I unintentionally actually repeated the spiral because I was trying to pull it off again with another piece of the paper. And that worked really well. That was a happy accident. I then tried to stamp a bit up on the top left-hand corner, but it was very, very, very minimal. So I'm actually just rolling that paintbrush. Can you see that? It's just rolling, and it's very watery. And I love that effect that it's given. It's as if it's, what do you call it? When, you know, there's peaks and troughs. That's what it's like. So again, I've just put some dashes of that turquoise blue down, and I end up removing most of it back off. But it just helps spread that turquoise blue about the gel plate without actually having to apply it in a way where it becomes a sort of more than a minor feature of the overall painting. So this is Amsterdam turquoise green, and I'm applying it with a silicone wedge colour shaper. You could use like a credit card or something, but you would need to be very gentle so you're not pulling off the underneath layers. So I'm using this to almost... So I've created the composition with the Paynes grey. And this is part of the composition as well, because I'm kind of creating almost like the structure with this turquoise green. If you think about the rule of thirds, I'm kind of roughly drawing these on the point of 1/3 from the bottom and 1/3 along from the right. So these begin quite rigid, but I use the paper to remove some of the paint, and it gives it a weathered look. And a lot of times when you see videos, movements look very fast, and some movements are fast, but a lot of the movements I'm using here are quite, they're very slow, they're very repetitive. They're a build-up, I suppose, rather than one quick movement. I'm trying to give that a circular look, but incomplete, to mimic the C shape of the Paynes grey. So again, just gradually pressing down on it, seeing how much pressure I can get away with. That's the scrunched up piece of paper again, so we're removing the paint and adding a bit of a stronger texture in here. Also, this paint's had a chance to dry somewhat as well. Now for this one, I'm just removing the kind of top wetter layer there. Top drier layer, sorry. And then I'm actually going to fold up that piece of paper, so while the edge isn't sharp, it's sharper than it would be if it was scrunched or laid flat. And I'm just making little horizontal lines, which some of them go deeper than others, some of them are clearer than others, and it just gives it a lovely weathered look. But all three, even though we've used paper to remove paint, they've all got a different look to them, and I really like that. That side was a lot drier, you can see, because there's not as much paint removed at all. So again, this was dry already. And then I'm adding in yellow ochre. This is Sennelier Abstract, their cheaper range. So you could do this with a credit card. We're just doing thin lines repeatedly, close together. End up getting a bit bored of it, and I just ended up doing a lot of lines without trying to space them evenly. I do prefer that look. I love the composition of this picture. I love how it, you know, in the end, the shapes, the textures, all that stuff. I think my colour palette was slightly, I don't think yellow ochre was the right, I felt my colour palette could have been slightly better. I'm not really sure how I could have changed it. What I would have changed, maybe swapped out the yellow ochre for like a raw sienna, maybe. So again, using the sponge, so I'm basically almost creating like a you know when you put powdered icing sugar on top of the cake, it kind of covers it, but it doesn't 100% cover it. That's the kind of effect that I was trying to get with the sponge with the yellow ochre there. And this caused me problems for a while, so I've created this kind of rigid, it's quite a solid shape coming up the middle of the gel plate, and then I try to kind of rectify it. It actually, for all it just looks like a dab of paint, I actually found that it was it wasn't becoming a focal point, but it was becoming a bit of a feature. It was attracting the eye, and it wasn't working. So at the end, I actually used a tiny little bit of sandpaper and gave it a slight rub, because even though I tried to get rid of the harsh lines of it here, they still came through at the end. So I'm using that scoring tool with the ball in the end just to try and rub it away to make some of the edges less harsh. Now, I could have went in with water. I have used a little bit of water, but I was limited to where I could use it because there was a lot of layers underneath. And so I didn't want to start removing a lot of the turquoise green or the cadmium lemon yellow or the Paynes grey, because there'd been a lot of work put into the textures and it really would have impacted the overall picture. This is right up the middle. So I just do my best, and then at the end I just give it a slight rub with the sandpaper. If you're using sandpaper though, just follow your health and safety. This is Pale Olive Green by the Art Deco Premium cheap brand. And I'm rolling the paintbrush here. I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I think I'm trying to counteract the amount of yellow ochre I put down. I'm also trying to think of more division in the overall picture. And also, the colours are quite mid-tone. There's not a lot of the cadmium lemon yellow. The Paynes grey is dark, and then the rest is very mid-tone. So this, helped to add in a bit of a lighter value. So just bear with me at this point, because I end up rolling the paintbrush in quite a structured way. That's it now. I'm starting to do it now. And it's actually given some very nice patterns. I'm still holding it quite loose though, and I've added more water to the paintbrush because we do want this to be a thin layer. I do get into the rhythm of it in a minute. There we go. That's it now. I'm rolling it with my hand. I do a close-up of it, you'll see it. Sorry, I was quite excited about this rolling the paintbrush. It's a nice pattern. It's quite soft. So I'm just trying to curve it so that it basically covers kind of the left vertical third and then the top third of the gel plate. It's quite amazing to see the different textures that are in there. I love using mixed media. I love using stencils, whether they are, you know, special stencils that you buy or ones that you make yourself. But there was something about making this picture today that made me feel a bit more confident about my own abilities, because this was all me. I didn't use something that somebody else designed, you know, and it's quite a good feeling. So I'm just using the rounded skewer to try and graduate away from the bottom edges of these to give it, you know, the blended look. And then we're going to pull it, and I'm going to use gold paint. I like using the metallics to pull them because I think when you have the overall metallic, it's transparent. It doesn't take over the picture. It's a light colour. And, you know, because it's all over, it doesn't come across as bits of gold on the picture. So I'm going to pull this with 300 GSM watercolour paper. And I chose it because it was a good quality paper and, you know, I wanted to get a good picture. Now, I've turned it upside down because then I can see the gel plate. I find I've got more control of these more complex layered pictures if I turn it and pull the gel plate off the paper. And I just love it. I have messed up the left-hand side slightly, but we fixed that. I'm just bowled over with it. There's so much variety in it, but it still looks good as one picture. Now, on the top left-hand side, you can see I've put thumbprints in it. That was daft. So this is me saying, oh, we could just cut that side off. I actually I actually quite like it like that, and I'm wondering if it's actually better with that side off. But, so I'm using very slight pressure with the sandpaper just to remove. What happens is when you put thumbprints in it, you also leave your fingerprints, and it looks like fingerprints. And then at the bottom here, what I'm doing is I was just sanding away a bit to kind of balance it, and then ever so slightly removing a little bit of this yellow ochre line that I had going up the middle of the gel plate. So this is it. This is the final picture. I love it. I think it's, you know, it looks quite alive, I think. And anyway, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. I hope you'll try it yourself, and take care. Bye, and see you soon.